Hello everyone. Good morning if you're here in the United States with us. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar on one of PRB's Engaged Presentations, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Marissa Yake. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst with PRB. I'll be joined today by Charlotte Feldman-Jacobs, who is Program Director for Gender here at PRB. Charlotte and I worked together on developing the presentation that we're sharing with you today. There are a few webinar logistics to note before we begin. First, there will be no audio interaction during this webinar. You'll be able to hear the presenter, me or Charlotte, but we won't be able to hear you speaking. If you'd like to submit a question, please use the questions pane in your GoToWebinar control panel. You can type in your question and click send to submit it. You are welcome to submit questions at any time, although we will save them and respond to as many questions as possible during the question and answer portion at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please submit a question and we will try to respond to you immediately. My colleague, Tyjen Conley, is standing by to help you troubleshoot if need be. If you are listening to this webinar on your telephone, we just want to remind you that you will incur long-distance charges depending on your telephone carrier. So we encourage you to listen to the webinar through your computer's audio. If you have a mobile phone or any other electronic handheld device, I recommend that you might want to move it away from your speakers as it can create some interference and affect your ability to hear the webinar. Finally, you might want to consider closing any other programs that are open on your computer because they may interfere with the quality of your connection. If you're having trouble seeing or hearing the webinar, please let us know, but also be aware that the problem may be due to the quality of your internet connection. So getting started, we'll begin with an overview of all of PRB's Engaged presentations and what we really mean by an Engaged presentation, and then discuss the specific presentation that we're sharing today, which is Family Planning and Gender Equality, Partners in Development. We'll show you the full presentation and then review the accompanying materials, such as what is available in the user guide to enable you to use these materials in your own work. Finally, we'll end with some time for me and Charlotte to respond to questions that arise. To begin with, what are these Engaged presentations? PRB's Engaged presentations are designed to be dynamic, multimedia presentations for policy communication about family planning and reproductive health issues. These presentations are designed to engage high-level leaders in critical conversations about family planning, reproductive health, and development. Through the presentations, complex research and data are distilled into simple messages and graphics, enabling leaders at all levels to really grasp the evidence base for investment in health as a key development strategy. And finally, these Engaged presentations are intended to be useful advocacy tools for all of you. So they're available online for people to download and use as part of their own work. The particular presentation that we're focusing on today, Family Planning and Gender Equality, Partners in Development, was developed with funding from the USAID Office of Population and Health through PRB's IDEA project, which stands for Informing Decision Makers to Act. Through this project, we aim to increase support among policy audiences for effective health and population programs around the world. The goals of Family Planning and Gender Equality are to explain how family planning and gender equality contribute to improved development outcomes, to highlight girls' secondary education and male involvement in family planning as two key strategies to focus on, and to learn from success stories in other countries related to fertility and girls' education. Through these, we hope to foster discussion among audiences about the needs for increased investment in family planning and gender equality. There are several different target audiences for this presentation. The primary audience is government policymakers at all levels and development donors who are in a position to allocate resources and advance family planning on the policy and program agenda. Secondary audiences include all of those who influence high-level policymakers, such as news media, civic and religious leaders, program officials, and other community leaders. This presentation is a tool that you can use to reach any of those audiences with messages about why family planning and gender equality are crucial for achieving development goals. For example, you might use the presentation with a group of regional policymakers to discuss the importance of investing in family planning and gender equality for development in their region. Or you might use the presentation with family planning or gender program officials who are preparing their programs and strategies to highlight the important relationship between family planning and gender equality. As you watch the presentation, I'd like you to consider how you might use it yourself as an advocacy or educational tool to reach a specific audience or group in your country. I'll go through the complete set of materials for this presentation in detail a little later in the webinar, but I want to give a brief overview now. The presentation is available in two formats, both of which you can download from PRB's website. One is a narrated video, and that's what I'm about to show you during this webinar. The other format is a clickable presentation, similar to PowerPoint, which you could stand up and deliver yourself live to an audience. In addition to the presentation itself, we have a user guide available, which provides instructions and support materials to use the presentation. So at this point, I'm happy to show you the presentation, Family Planning and Gender Equality, Partners in Development.
Family Planning and Gender Equality, Partners in Development. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, men and women are changing the course of their countries. There are countless instances of this happening. In our story, we'll call them Mirembe and Ocheng. When Mirembe and Ocheng were ready to get married, they formed a vision for their family. They decided together to use family planning and to give their children opportunities that they themselves never had. Through her 20s, Mirembe gave birth to 3 healthy children. They were delivered safely in health facilities and received all of their immunizations on time. Now, all 3 children are attending school and forming hopes and dreams for their lives. As the children have grown, Mirembe has had time to work outside of the home and contribute income to the family. Mirembe is able to act on her own decisions and pursue her own dreams and aspirations. Mirembe and Ocheng's vision for their family is coming true. Their family is now healthier and contributing more to the economy and community. For the country, this means that poverty and mortality are declining. Because of family planning and gender equality, development is happening. But across sub-Saharan African countries, there is more that needs to be done. UN member nations have agreed to a set of goals called the Millennium Development Goals to make sure that these types of opportunities are expanding. An important component of achieving all of these goals is family planning. Throughout the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, there has been a substantial increase in family planning use in the last 20 years. Between 1990 and 2010, the proportion of couples using any form of family planning nearly doubled from 12% to 23%. But right now, almost the same proportion, 22% of married couples, have an unmet need for family planning, meaning they want to delay their next birth or not have any more children, but are not using any form of family planning. So while there are many couples using family planning in sub-Saharan Africa right now, there are also many more who want to do so. A special focus on MDG number 3 to promote gender equality and empower women will help to achieve family planning goals as well as all MDGs. Gender equality means a balance in the power and privileges, responsibilities, and resources that men and women possess. Some examples of gender equality include women's and men's ability to make important life decisions, including when to marry and when and how many children to have. It also means that women are free to move about and work outside the home, that they have equal access to opportunities such as education, and that they have equitable representation in leadership positions. When women are empowered in these ways, they can realize their potential and contribute more fully to their community and country. Family planning and gender equality go hand in hand. Because family planning empowers women to make decisions about when and how many children to have. But at the same time, gender equality can lead to increases in family planning use. With gender equality and family planning, including both modern and traditional methods, women and couples can choose the timing and spacing of each pregnancy. It also ensures that couples can have the number of children they want and can care for. This can reduce the economic burden on poor families, and at the same time, women have more time to work outside the home and meet the needs of their families. Together, these lead to increased family income. And with more income, families can invest in health, food, and education for each child. Families can also invest in their own livelihoods and break the cycle of poverty. At the same time, at the national level, family planning can lead to more manageable population growth. With a slower growth rate, the government can better provide social services such as education and healthcare, can invest in economic infrastructure and job growth, and can sustainably manage natural resources for future development. The result is increased economic productivity and growth for the entire nation. Together, family planning and gender equality lead to poverty reduction and economic growth both at the family level and at the national level, making them necessary components of strategies to achieve development goals. Two important strategies to promote gender equality and family planning are increasing girls' secondary education and increasing male involvement in family planning and health. In addition to conferring literacy and skills, secondary education lays a groundwork for girls in accessing opportunities throughout their lifetime and in being healthy, empowered, and productive. Secondary education is critical to starting women on this path to improved health and wealth throughout their lives. And these changes affect not only women, but their families and children. Research has shown that girls' secondary education leads to reduced risk of HIV, lower risk of poor maternal health and maternal mortality, and decreased infant and child mortality, as well as increases in child immunization rates, improved household nutrition, and greater educational attainment for children. And in addition to these health outcomes, women with secondary education also access family planning in order to achieve their desired family size and spacing. This graph shows us the percentage of women using any form of family planning in a few African countries. This is family planning use among women with no education. Now, in these red bars, we see that family planning use increases among women with primary education. But look at the difference secondary education makes. Looking at the green bars, we see that family planning use increases even more among the women who have accessed secondary education, to between 40 and 60% of those women. This graph shows us what a difference secondary education makes in empowering women to use family planning. The result is lower fertility as these women are able to plan and space their families. Let's take a closer look at this by turning to our bubble graph, where we can look at changes and trends over time. And we'll focus on two country success stories. Tunisia and Indonesia show how governments have made investments in gender equality and family health that translated to improvements in education and development over time. On the left axis, we have the average number of births per woman, which we call the fertility rate, ranging from 0 to about 6 children per woman. On the bottom, we have the percent of girls of secondary school age enrolled in secondary school, ranging from 0 to 100%. In 1980, these two countries were very similar to the situation across sub-Saharan Africa today. In Tunisia, 16% of secondary school age girls were enrolled in school, and the average woman had 5 children. The government had long guaranteed gender equality and education and was offering free family planning services. In Indonesia in 1980, things were similar. About 21% of girls were enrolled in secondary school, and the fertility rate was between 4 and 5 children. The Indonesian government was also supporting family planning, including an extensive community-based distribution program. So let's play this forward and see what changed in these two countries in the last few decades. In Tunisia, the government continued scaling up family planning services, and the commitment to girls' education encouraged later marriage. In 1995, the government issued a policy to increase women's rights within marriage. In Indonesia, community-based distribution and social marketing of family planning was strong. And in 1990, Islamic religious leaders issued a declaration that family planning had a direct benefit to families. The government has expanded education opportunities and in 1994 issued a policy to increase basic compulsory education to 9 years. We can see that in a period of about 30 years, these two countries increased girls' secondary school enrollment so that more than 2/3 of girls were enrolled in secondary school, while fertility has dropped to just about 2 children per woman. How did they do it? Political commitment was instrumental. In both countries, the governments issued policies supportive of gender equality, educational attainment, and family planning, and followed through with commitment to implement those programs. But remember that across the countries of sub-Saharan Africa today, women are having between 5 and 6 children each, and fewer than 1 out of every 4 girls of secondary school age are enrolled in secondary school. Even fewer will be able to continue to complete their secondary degree. This means that countries are missing out on a powerful resource. Data show that just 1 year of secondary education boosts a woman's wages later in life by 15 to 25%. In an environment where women can access and use family planning, they can space or limit their births so as to be able to work outside the home, taking advantage of this increased level of income. And we've seen this happen in other countries. Data from Bangladesh, where researchers have studied the impact of family planning for more than 20 years, show that women who have access to comprehensive family planning, maternal and child health services earn higher incomes. Even when comparing women with the same level of education, those who lived in an area with access to the comprehensive family planning program earned more money, the equivalent of 50% more income each year. Together, the combination of increased education and access to family planning enables women to pursue their aspirations and makes women powerful contributors to their families and communities. But changes in society, especially surrounding gender norms, cannot happen by working with half of the population alone. Men must be engaged to create an environment for gender equality and better health, particularly where family planning is concerned. Gender equality means men and women sharing equal balance in power and responsibilities. Yet all too often, men hold the power to make family decisions, including choices about family size and contraception, while women alone are given the responsibility for using family planning or childbearing. Engaging men in family planning means sharing the power to make family planning decisions with their wives and partners. It also means encouraging men to share the responsibility for acquiring and using contraception, as well as participating in and supporting maternal and child health care. Research from around the world indicates that when men are engaged in family planning and communicate with their wives and partners about using contraception or planning their next child, family planning use increases. Men who choose to be involved in this way promote better family health as couples make choices together about the healthy timing and spacing of pregnancy. One recent study in more than 250 rural Malawi villages showed that among men who were given information and encouragement from their peers about using family planning, use of modern methods increased from 0 to about 78%. Dialogue about family planning decisions increased among these couples who made these decisions together. Given the right opportunities, changes in gender equality and family planning can happen in a short time, improving women's and family health, enabling women's contributions to the country, and building the development potential for the nation. Right now, you have an opportunity to invest in gender equality and invest in the potential of today's girls and boys. Political will is the key to making these opportunities a reality. Top political leaders should advocate for the inclusion of family planning as a key component of all relevant development programs, such as poverty reduction strategies and programs aimed at achieving the MDGs. Health sector leaders should work with girls and women, boys and men, to change gender norms about men's and women's roles in sexual and reproductive health, and especially around fertility decisions. All ministries should work together to expand opportunities for girls to attend and complete secondary school. Leaders at all levels should speak out in support of family planning, women's and girls' empowerment, and engaging men and boys on these important issues. It's important to work with men and women together to address gender equality and family planning. Increasing gender equality and family planning through girls' secondary schooling and male involvement will help governments make strides in reaching all Millennium Development Goals. Because when men and women are powerful partners and in control of their fertility, the impacts are felt throughout society. Together, family planning and gender equality are partners for development. If all girls and women were given opportunities for education and empowerment, and if all women and couples could plan and space their families, entire nations would begin to see gender equality benefiting everyone. Countries would realize the full potential and dreams of their women and girls, men and boys, and the promise of better lives for generations to come.
I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. If you have questions about the content of the presentation, Charlotte and I will be happy to address those at the end of the webinar during the Q&A. And as a reminder, you are welcome to submit questions at any time. So what you just saw was the narrated video of the Family Planning and Gender Equality Partners in Development presentation. It's in a standard video file format, which should play on most computer media players like Windows Media Player or QuickTime. The file is large. It's about 200 megabytes, and so if you have a poor internet connection, we realize that it might be hard for you to access and download that file through the internet. The other format is the clickable presentation that you could use to deliver the presentation live yourself. This is in Flash, and it's about 100 megabytes. This file functions very similarly to a PowerPoint in that you can use the forward arrow on your computer to advance one slide at a time as you deliver the presentation. The user guide includes the complete script for the presentation. So between the user guide and the presentation file, we've given you everything that you need to deliver the presentation yourself. This format of presentation differs from PowerPoint, however, in that you are not able to edit or modify the presentation at all. You won't be able to add or remove slides, and you won't be able to change the content of each slide. If you have difficulty accessing the materials online, you are welcome to contact me, and I'll provide my email at the end of the presentation, and I'll do my best to mail a copy of the files on CD to you if that's easier. And all of these materials are now available in English as well as French. I'll now take you through the user guide and supplemental materials for this presentation so that you can see more fully what is available. What you see here is a picture of our standard Engaged user guide, which includes instructions relevant to all of PRB's Engaged presentations. This includes an explanation of the technology and file formats that we're using, and instructions on how to set up both the narrated video presentation and the clickable presentation. This user guide also includes overall guidance on delivering effective presentations and being a good presenter. The presentation guide for this presentation contains the information a user would need specific to the content of this presentation. This is a separate document from the standard Engage user guide, and both are available on PRB's website. In this user guide, we address the presentation goals and intended audiences and uses. We include the script for the presentation if you want to deliver it yourself. We include a handout that you can use, questions for discussion with an audience, and a section on frequently asked questions, or FAQ. And we also include the full references to the data sources used in the presentation and a listing of additional resources that you may want to consult to learn more about the issues and the research raised in the presentation. This user guide starts with an overview of the presentation, including presentation objectives. What you see here is a visual of the actual user guide, and this summarizes what I shared at the beginning of this webinar about the key messages in this presentation. I know you probably aren't able to read this text, but my goal is just to walk you through the user guide and give you a sense of what's available if you access these materials on your own. Under Opportunities to give the presentation, the guide summarizes the target audiences for the presentation and offers examples of how and why you might try to reach a selection of audiences with the messages in these materials. The next part of the user guide is the presentation script. This is the complete script to narrate the presentation, just as you heard it now. What you see on the left is the presentation script, just how it appears in the user guide. If you wanted to deliver this presentation live using the clickable presentation file, you can follow this script in your delivery. And you can see that the script is formatted with an arrow and the words click forward and a number. Every time you see that in the script, you just advance the presentation by one slide using your keyboard arrow and then read the text that follows. The numbers correspond to the slide numbers, which appear in the bottom left corner of the clickable presentation. So you can always confirm that you're reading the correct narration for each slide. So for example, right now, we're looking at slide 2, and you would want to ensure that you're reading the narration for slide 2 in the script. So really all you need to do to deliver this presentation yourself is to have the script in front of you and open the file on your computer. Then you click the forward arrow, read the script, and click forward to the next slide. And if you want to modify the script and revise the language to make it more comfortable for you, or to add some anecdotes or additional data about your country, you're of course welcome to alter the script and do that for yourself. The next section of the user guide covers handouts. What you see here is the first page of a 4-page handout that is included in the user guide. You can photocopy or print copies of this handout to give to your audience if you use the presentation. The handout includes snapshots of the presentation visuals along with the key concepts. In addition to this handout, the user guide includes instructions for creating a customized handout of relevant indicators using PRB's Data Finder. Creating a customized handout won't include the visuals and the layout that you see here, but allows you to select data that is relevant to the presentation and specific to your country or context. This will help you to connect the messages in the presentation with the evidence relevant to your context for your audience. For example, for this presentation, you might use Data Finder to pull up the level of unmet need for family planning among married women in your country. Next in the user guide, we have a set of questions for discussion. After sharing the presentation with your audience, you would probably want to engage them in some discussion of the key issues raised. You may have ideas of your own questions, but the user guide offers some suggestions of questions you might ask to get the audience talking, which you're welcome to use or to choose your own questions. For example, you might ask your audience for ideas on how gender equality and family planning could be integrated in their country setting. And your audience hopefully would respond with questions and discussion on their own. We also have a section on frequently asked questions and responses, or FAQ. After seeing the presentation, the audience may ask questions about the data, the concepts, or the issues, and this section should help you to anticipate some of the more challenging questions that the audience might ask and offers suggestions on how you might respond. You can certainly choose to provide your own answers in your own way, but we hope that by reading this section in advance, you'll feel confident to respond to any of the questions that arise. I'd also like to draw your attention to PRB's Engaged Snapshots. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, our Engaged presentations are multimedia tools for policy communication and advocacy around critical issues in family planning, reproductive health, and development. Family planning and gender equality, partners in development, is one of these presentations, and others are available on topics such as youth, sexual and reproductive health, family planning and poverty reduction, and the population, health, and environment relationship. In addition to these presentations, we have a series of Engaged presentation snapshots, which are short 2 to 4 minute multimedia videos. These are available on PRB's website only as narrated videos, but they're much shorter and more focused than the larger presentations. The Engaged snapshots can be downloaded in the same way as the full presentations and can be easily embedded to play as videos within a PowerPoint presentation, or you can play them on their own as video files. This makes them effective tools for enhancing your own work and your own presentations if perhaps the full-length Engaged presentation is not the right choice for a given audience or opportunity. And because they're so short, these videos are smaller file sizes, making them easier to download and stream, and also very easy to share online. 2 of the snapshots in this series, Family Planning and Gender Equality Go Hand in Hand, and Girls' Secondary Education is a Pathway to Improved Health, are adapted from the content in the longer Engaged presentation that you saw today. So if some of the messages you saw would be appropriate for your work, but you don't want the full presentation, I encourage you to review the snapshots that we have available to see if one of those shorter pieces would be a good choice for you. As I wrap up this portion of the webinar, I want to remind you of the intended use of this presentation, Family Planning and Gender Equality, Partners in Development. This is a multimedia advocacy tool that we hope advocates, educators, and others will be able to use in their work to help the key audiences of high-level leaders and decision makers to understand the important role that family planning and gender equality can play in improving development outcomes, and to highlight secondary education for girls and male involvement in family planning as 2 key strategies to promote family planning and gender equality. Since it was originally published nearly 2 years ago, this presentation has been used in a variety of these ways. It has been used with some small community groups in Zambia to introduce the topics of family planning and gender equality and set the stage for discussion about their community. It's been used with leadership training in Kenya to ensure that women leaders have a grounding in these issues and understand the data. And it's been shared with groups working on the population health and environment interrelationship in East Africa to introduce the idea of gender topics into their work. As an advocacy tool, this is available on PRB's website along with the user guide materials to help you share the presentation with audiences and spark policy dialogue about how investments in family planning and gender equality lead to healthier and stronger families, communities, and nations. If you have any questions about the presentation materials, the presentation itself, or the content, or Engaged materials in general, please go ahead and type them into the questions pane of your GoToWebinar control panel. Charlotte and I will do our best to respond to all of the questions we receive, but we apologize in advance if we're not able to respond to everything in the time that we have remaining. At this point, I'm happy to turn it over to Charlotte Feldman-Jacobs, Program Director for Gender here at PRB, to respond to the first few questions we've received.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Charlotte Feldman-Jacobs. I'm happy to be a part of this discussion. I'm sure that a lot of you will have questions that we may have to do some additional research to get back to you. We didn't intend to put ourselves forward as the penultimate answers of education and family planning, but in putting together this webinar and this multimedia, we came upon some very interesting aspects of gender, and some of your questions have touched on a lot of them. The first question is, why do we focus on girls' secondary education for gender equality? And the participant rightly asks, have you not thought about other important strategies to achieve gender equality? And yes, absolutely. There are many different and important strategies to promoting gender equality. This presentation focused on girls' secondary education because there's research that's proven that it leads to both greater gender equality and positive health-related outcomes for women and families, as well as for economic benefits and growth of nations and its citizens. We, of course, are very mindful that the MDG 2 talks about primary education, but the research shows there's even greater impact with secondary education, and the statistic that we use in the multimedia is increased earnings of 15 to 25%. Another question has to do with the flip side of that, and that is why focus only on education? And of course we have made it clear, I think, in here that we are focused very much on the important role played by family planning as an empowering force with education. There are several examples of why education alone might not be enough in achieving empowerment. There are, for instance, young women, young brides, who, without options for spacing and delaying childbirth, wouldn't actually increase the well-being of themselves, their families, their communities. The impact on mothers and babies if women don't have the empowerment needed to space and delay and limit children that they want. I think we mentioned in a number of places that the unmet need is something that can be better addressed when education is combined with family planning. Let's see. A third question is, as women become more empowered, won't men lose status and power and have a negative consequence for both of them? And I think that that's an important point. Men are definitely a very important part of realizing gender equity and development, and there are many ways that they've been identified as critical to the entire process. The partners with their spouses in making these decisions, in accessing family planning, as clients themselves in healthcare, accessing healthcare for themselves, and in agents of change to change a lot of the norms around men that occur, societal expectations, being a man, being tough, brave, aggressive, that all have impacts on themselves and on partners and families, children especially. Let's see. We have so many other questions. Marissa, do you have some?
Thanks, Charlotte. Yes, we've received a few questions. A few people have asked about if the materials are going to be available in Spanish. And I'm so glad to hear that there's an interest and people are interested in using these in Spanish-speaking environments. Unfortunately, I have to say that at this time we don't have any plans for translating the materials. But knowing that people are interested in using the materials in other languages really helps us to make the case that this is something we should do in the future. So thank you for your interest, and we will try to let you know if the plans to translate the materials change at any point in the future. I also have a question about where some of the data comes from. And the data that we shared in this presentation are a few years out of date. As I mentioned, the presentation was originally published in 2012. And so the data are the most accurate that anybody had about family planning and gender equality at that time. The majority of the data in the presentation came from the most recent demographic and health surveys and multiple indicator cluster surveys at that time, as well as the World Bank's World Development Indicators database and some other recent research studies.
One other question we have is about this presentation being used as an introduction to gender-sensitive programming for healthcare providers and program managers. And I think we've had a lot of experience with healthcare providers asking to use this presentation. We had a workshop at Women Deliver in Malaysia where people were very interested in how family planning and gender equality would play an integral part in clinics where men are not included, for instance, because of time constraints, because of lack of education for healthcare providers on why men and women together give a greater outcome in family planning. The training of healthcare providers, the question asks about gender-sensitive programming. It would even be more applicable to talk about gender-transformative programming, because what we're hoping for with this partnership of gender and family planning is that the change in norms is something that drives the use of family planning and that makes education for girls and boys safer. Let's see. Someone asks about the implications in urban areas in India. I think all of these are applicable in urban areas as well as rural areas. I think that healthcare providers in India are very mindful of the fact that girls sometimes cannot come to clinics alone, including men in that, and especially for young brides, I think is very applicable to urban India. The the accessibility of family planning methods for women, especially there's data that shows the higher education, the more likely a woman is to use family planning. And I know there are interventions in India where educating girls who have been married off young leads to greater empowerment for the girls and greater life chances for their families, and in turn for their children, who are then given education themselves because there are more resources. And the next question is about education, about such a presentation for women and men who are not educated. And this questioner is from India also, but there are materials on the PRB website about family planning saves lives. And I think you'll find a lot of interesting messages there relating to the transformative nature of family planning that could be aimed at educated and uneducated populace.
On that note of using the materials with audiences who are not educated, as we noted, the target audiences for this presentation are really high-level decision makers and community leaders, and so we are generally targeting audiences who have some level of education. I know some of those community leaders may not have a lot of education, and I think some of the snapshot materials that I introduced would be great for these audiences. Although they're narrated, you can certainly frame them in your own way and offer additional explanation afterwards because they are so short, only 2 to 4 minutes. And with the audiences that we've used, even those who are less educated, we find that people are really interested in the data and the evidence and knowing what the research has to say about these topics.
There's one question here about, in Africa we have some traditional education and religious education. What about Muslim education and family planning? I personally had an experience with this in Indonesia, where a woman who was the head of the largest women's Muslim organization that ran girls' schools throughout Indonesia, who gave a wonderful presentation on how their health and life education classes in the school prepare young women for their lives and for choices that they make together with their families on birth control methods, family planning decisions, on sexuality, preventing violence against girls. And it's a wonderful lesson that leaders of all stripes, whether it's religious or community or education leaders, healthcare leaders, can insert lessons and education throughout girls and boys' lives to lead to a better life for all of them. How to provide family planning commodities to the girl child in the second cycle school in communities where it's culturally negative to talk about sexuality in order to meet their unmet needs. I assume this is speaking about unmarried girls in communities, because I know there are some programs in keeping young marrieds in secondary school, and I think in those cases it's more acceptable to talk about contraceptive sexuality. These changes are not going to be wrought by girls present in secondary school. It's going to be more change that needs to start with policymakers, educators, committees, and community leaders within those areas. And I think that some of those discussions have begun around the world in developing and developed nations around keeping girls safe and achieving their greatest potential. And whether it's using the word sexuality or not, I think improving lives is something that all community leaders and religious leaders are very committed to. And as the example from Indonesia gave, it's part of the life and health lessons that we all want for our children. Well, here's a tough one. This one's also from India, about stigma and desire for male children. And this questioner references that it's a major barrier while advocating for family planning. So PRB has a policy brief out you can find on our website, prb.org, that addresses that exact barrier and stigma, that sex selection is a problem, and one that we have tried to address in that brief. The problem being it's not going away, and there are three cogs that that brief addresses, one being increases in technology, as people can tell whether a baby is going to be a girl or a boy. That knowledge could be used in a harmful way, with fewer babies being born to a family because they choose to meet their unmet need. They choose to have 2 or 3 children instead of 8. Does the stigma get worse? Probably. And there is the stigma itself, that male children are preferable to girl children. And yet in that brief we have some examples of how in several countries civil society and governments have worked together to address those 3 areas and to work with healthcare providers and with policymakers to change the norms that underlie this, whether it's naming girls with the unwanted child, whether it's incentives to keep girls in school and to not see them as a negative family characteristic. But there are some examples in there, and some of them are from India. I think you'll find them interesting. I think we're just about out of time.
Yeah, so unfortunately that's about all of the time that we have available. So I'd like to wrap up and thank all of you for taking the time to participate in this webinar. We are recording this session, so we'll follow up with all of you in a few days to provide a link to the recorded webinar. And that will include a set of links that you see here. And these are the key links for the materials that we referenced throughout the presentation, so that you can go ahead and access everything that we discussed today. If you do have an opportunity to use any of these materials, we would love to hear about it. You can contact me directly at myeakey@prb.org, and I'd love to know how you used the materials, what the outcome was, and how we can better support your work with data and materials about family planning and reproductive health. Before we end, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my colleague, Charlotte Feldman-Jacobs, for her role in developing these materials and responding to questions during the webinar today. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues Tyjen Conley and Angela Farmer for producing this webinar and making all of the materials accessible. That concludes our webinar. Thank you.